Hey students, my name is David Garby. Feel free to call me Dr. Dave. I'm the Director of Outreach and Education for a nonprofit organization called the Pennsylvania Society for Biomedical Research, and I will explain a little bit more about what I do in that role in a few minutes. So I was asked to talk about my heritage, and although I've never done anything in the likes of Ancestry.com, I'm pretty sure that my background is mostly German with a little bit of English and Scandinavian thrown in. I was also asked to talk about my upbringing. Right? So my upbringing, like most kids, was a lot of fun and mixed in with a little bit of hard times, I'm sure. So I spent the first 11 years of my life in a town in the United States called Meriden, Connecticut, with my mom, dad, and two siblings. Before 6th grade, my parents ended up divorcing, and along with my mom, who remarried, and my brother and sister, I moved to a small town in New York, a small rural town in New York called Narrowsburg, New York. The school that I went to for middle and high school was extremely tiny. So believe it or not, the entire public school of Narrowsburg, kindergarten through 12th grade, was in one building, and there was only about 300 kids. I graduated with only 15 other classmates. So needless to say, there were times that when growing up in a small town, I lacked a lot of modern advantages that other students might have had. However, the intimacy and the community feel of a small town actually, I believe, helped mold me into the person that I am today. So I worked very hard throughout my middle and high school years, both academically, and I got my first job when I was 14 years old at a local cafe, and I stuck with that job until I was in college. After graduating high school, I went to a small liberal arts college called Muhlenberg College in Allentown, Pennsylvania, where I studied biology. After college, I worked in a research lab for a few years and then realized that I loved science so much that I went back to school, called graduate school, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So what do I do and where do I work? Well, I am currently the Director of Outreach and Education for a nonprofit organization called the Pennsylvania Society for Biomedical Research. We provide informal science outreach education to students in the classroom, directly in the classroom, that need additional scientific activities and presentations. So what does that really mean? Well, I think of myself as the grandparent or the grandfather of classroom. You know what I mean, right? Parents are the strict ones, usually setting all the rules and the discipline. On the other hand, grandparents are the ones that get you excited. They spoil you with special treats, but then get to give you back to the parents at the end of the day. I believe I have the pleasure of being a grandparent in the classroom. Again, I get to bring in cool activities, cool presentations, get kids excited about doing science, and then I get to give you back to your teachers. So as part of this job as the Director of Outreach and Education for PSBR, I get to do a lot of cool things, interact with a lot of different types of students, and I get to design new programs that I bring to classrooms on a weekly basis. So I do this usually from the comfort of my own home, or in the classroom. I get to do a lot of cool things. You can see here my fish tanks and some of my science materials and equipment. In back of me is what I call my little lab bench, where I get to work out experiments to bring into the classroom. There's another fish tank back there. So I really get the pleasure of being home when I'm not on the road visiting a school. But I haven't always had this job. So I only joined PSBR about 3.5 years ago. And I actually have my PhD or my doctorate degree in cell and molecular biology. And I did biomedical research for over 16 years. I studied many processes in our bodies and diseases that occur, including cancer research, major depression disorder, circadian biology, our daily biological rhythms, and even questions surrounding why we sleep. As a scientist, I got to use many different types of really cool equipment. For example, some high-powered microscopes that allowed us to look directly inside of cells within a living organism. I got to work with a lot of molecular biology equipment, such as thermocyclers or PCR machines, gel electrophoresis equipment. I got to clone genes and put those back into animals. And a lot of these pieces of equipment or techniques allow us to study the underlying basic biology of our bodies, or the organs within our bodies, or the cells within the organs in our bodies. And we can dig even deeper and look at some of the molecules inside of our cells, like DNA and proteins, and what they're doing for a particular cell type in our bodies. So we really want to have a better understanding of how biology works. And once we have a better understanding of what normally happens, then we can better understand the diseases that occur when sometimes those processes in our bodies, for example, break down. So when talking about educational and work requirements to get into this field, that question can be a little bit complicated, only because in the field of biomedical science, it's a very broad field. This includes jobs like doctors and nurses and veterinarians and dentists and forensic scientists and being a scientist. So it's tough to really nail down one particular requirement. So each of those different jobs or professions may have different levels of experiences and education that are required. So in specifically talking about being a scientist, which is what I spent most of my professional life doing, there are also, unfortunately, many options. For example, I started to do science right out of college, again, in a cancer research lab as a research specialist or research technician. And I was able to do that for 3 years, and I even published my first paper without having any additional education or experience. All right? But I loved doing science so much that after that, I went back to graduate school, spent an additional 5.5 years doing my thesis work to get my PhD, and then worked in a lab both in the pharmaceutical business and in the academic world, meaning a hospital or university setting, for my professional journey after that. So I should mention that while a college degree isn't required to get into this field, I won't lie to you, it will help. And after every degree you obtain, it's probably pretty obvious that you'll be able to obtain additional professional opportunities, or additional professional opportunities will open up with every amount of education or every amount of experience that you acquire. So how did I get inspired to become a scientist? Well, I actually enjoyed science, biology specifically, throughout high school and throughout college. I actually had plans to go to medical school to become a medical doctor or a physician after graduating college. But as I mentioned, I started doing science, and there was no turning back. I fell in love with it at that point. So after graduating college, I already mentioned I became a research assistant and did my own project in investigating a gene that we thought played a role in cancer development. And I should also mention again that I did work in the pharmaceutical world for a business entity, working on new medications that were involved, or we wanted to treat patients with mood disorders such as major depression disorder or schizophrenia and bipolar disease. So now working for the Pennsylvania Society for Biomedical Research, I really want to do the inspiring myself. Going into classrooms, I get to talk to students on a weekly, if not daily basis about why it's so valuable, why it's so cool, why it's so fun to become a scientist. So I don't have a particular moment in time that I was inspired to become a scientist, but I hope that I can offer that inspiration to the next generation of thought leaders and future scientists. So I often get asked, what is the best part of being a scientist? And for me, that was discovering new things. So think about it for a moment. Right? You get to ask a question that nobody else in the history of this world has ever asked before. And you go out and you design your experiments, you do your experiments, you collect your data, and if those experiments work, when those experiments work, you have a piece of new information that nobody else ever knew before. So for me, that was incredibly exciting to hold that piece of information and to know that I was the one that discovered it. It may not be earth-shattering or groundbreaking. It's not going to win me a Nobel Prize, but that ability to go ask a question and then figure out the answer was really, really exciting for me. Right? And just asking questions in general. I'm somebody who loves to ask questions, and being able to do that day in and day out as my job, for me, it really couldn't have gotten any better than that. And finally, I was asked to provide some words of advice to STEM students. I have a few words. Be curious, ask questions, and don't be afraid to go figure something out yourself. Right? You should always, always, always be willing to remain challenged. You should find pleasure in learning new things and adapting to situations. And finally, you shouldn't be afraid to fail. Failure is an option. If you're not failing, if you're always succeeding, then you're not trying hard enough. We learn many new things by failing. So don't always feel like you have to get the right answer. Don't always feel like you have to have the A+ in the class, because you learn just as much by not knowing and going out and figuring out the answer than you do by just knowing every single answer that comes your way. Best of luck to everybody that's listening, and feel free to reach out if you have any additional questions. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.